Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Rotherham Landlord Seminar. Firstly, I'd like to thank our panel of experts who've given us a little bit of their time this evening. That's Raj, Russell, Karina and James. Thanks, really do appreciate it. We've tried to model tonight on BBC Question Time, hence the cameras and all the things that go with it. And our very own David Dimbleby here is Mr. Christopher Watkins, who's a well-known property journalist from Grantham, and you've come up from Grantham. At Bricknell Rentals, we do recognise that it's a tough time for landlords at the minute, what with all the regulations and the tax things and all the things that go with it. So we wanted to put on tonight to give a forum where people can listen to what's going to happen in the Rotherham property market, we hope, looking at the past, and also giving a forum for people to ask questions that are of concern to them. So without ado, I'd like to pass over to Christopher Watkins. But first of all, I'd also like to thank Tony and his colleague for tonight. And we are doing a video because a lot of landlords couldn't be here tonight and they did want to participate. So we're going to be emailing this out to them. So if anybody would like a copy for their future reference, don't hesitate to contact me. So, Chris, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
There we go. Is it working? There we go. Good. There we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Watkin, and I'm a property journalist and talk about the property market. And I want to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about Rotherham property market. If you want to know what's going to happen in the future, I think the best place to look at is the past, see what's happened there. So we're going to start off with what's happened in the Rotherham property market over the last 1 year, 5 years, 20 years. We're going to look at renting. Now, all of you are landlords, and because you are landlords, you want to know what's the future of the rental market. So I'm going to touch heavily on that, and I'm going to show you my thoughts of why the rental market will continue to grow. Then we'll come on and talk about different areas of Rotherham and where probably the best places to invest in and what sort of things you should be investing in. Then I've given the four panellists one question each before the evening, because we've had a lot of emails in from people wanting results. And then I've got a series of questions that they don't know anything about that we're just going to throw in there like a hand grenade and see what comes out. We'll also have the roving mic as well, so if you've got any questions, we can ask those as well. And we should all be finished for something like 7:30 or something, so you can be on the way. And again, we're stopping over afterwards if you want any questions answering. So if you're ready, let's go. Okay. So the first part of the presentation is these are the three questions that I am going to look at this evening. What's happened to the Rotherham property market in the last 20 years? What is the future of the rental market? Why people aren't buying anymore? And where should you be buying in Rotherham? So let's have a look at the sort of numbers that we're talking. Interestingly, when I looked at the old South Yorkshire area and chopped it up into the four different areas, when you actually looked at what happened to property prices, Rotherham's actually gone up by 219% compared to Barnsley at 216 and Donny at 243. Sheffield really has been the star performer of the South Yorkshire property market. A lot of that is to do with the student market when you actually look at what's happened to property prices, but there is a proviso in there, and we'll come on to the next slide here, which I thought is particularly interesting. On this graph here, what you have got is the four different areas of South Yorkshire, starting on the left-hand side to what happened to property prices in 1995. Now, what you'll notice is that, let's look at Sheffield to start with. She took off quite well, and she really did rocket through in the 90s, in the magic years of 2002, 3, 4. We can all remember house prices going up by 10, 20% a year. But if you actually notice, when she did drop, and they all dropped in, it was around February 09, and they all dropped for around 16 months. Sheffield did drop the most, as you can see with the yellow. Whilst if you look at Rotherham, whilst it's a middle of the pack sort of property, that it rose quite well, but when she did drop in 2009 and 10, it didn't drop as badly. And yes, since 2000 and I think it's 2009, 2010, she's grown along with everyone else. But it's when you compare it with the likes of Barnsley, you'll notice that the performance has been quite good. The best way I could describe Rotherham is that it's a middle of the road sort of town when you compare it with the rest of Yorkshire. There are towns that offer better returns, probably better yields. There are towns that offer better capital growth. But if you just want a good, happy mix of properties that let well and sell well, that always fill well, Rotherham, I've always found, looking at the void periods, is pretty good. But there are some provisos which we'll come on to later in the presentation. Interestingly, since the property price crash, as you say, Sheffield did drop the most. So on this slide, Sheffield looks like it has performed the best, and it has performed really well. But on the actual drop, she dropped like a stone in 2009. And as you can see, Doncaster, Barnsley, and Rotherham are all very similar, around that 11 or 12% rise, which, you know, when you're looking at a growth in the last 10 years, you know, if you've been getting, you know, 1-2%, which is roughly where you are, you do need some decent yields to make up for capital growth. But, you know, I wouldn't be too offended by that, because yes, in London you've had decent capital growth, you know, but the yields have been absolutely appalling. And it's that balancing act of capital growth and yield, which again we'll talk about later in the presentation, to where you invest your money. In terms of Rotherham itself, property prices are 1% higher than they were 12 months ago. Now, this particular graph here looks like it's all over the place, but I think it's a particularly interesting graph. And this shows you the median property selling prices for Rotherham since 1995. Now, it does look like a bit of an ECG graph here, you know, up and down like a heart monitor. But what you'll notice is that detached houses have gone up in price by 296%, semi-detached houses by 236%, terraced at 204%, but flats only 108% in the last 23 years. So the question is, why have flats not performed as well as terraced or semis? And again, we can touch on that a little bit later. But if it compared to other towns, that is pretty much the trend outside London. The best, although what is particularly interesting, and that is Rotherham plus 3 miles, so it's obviously coming out as far as here, which is obviously the posh bit of Rotherham. What's particularly interesting is that detached houses are the best performing type of property. What you'll tend to find in most of Britain is that the best performing properties have been semi-detached and terraced houses. So I don't know why detached houses have performed better, but they quite clearly have. We are going to be coming into a time potentially in the next couple of years where property prices will drop. What this graph here shows you the trend of what's been happening to property prices year on year since 2009. So if you can see in 2009, property prices were dropping at the order of around 10 to 15% a year. Then back in 2010, I think we've got a bit of a laser here. Have we got a laser? Well, no. As you can see here, when we were in 2010 or 11, things went up. Then she dropped down again, but since then she's been slowly on the rise. In terms of where the property prices are going to go in the next 12 months, it is my opinion that property prices will remain the same or drop by about 1 or 2% in Rotherham and the whole of South Yorkshire, due to the slight level of uncertainty and confidence. But on the whole scheme of things, I don't think that's a huge amount when you consider that property prices are still 11% higher than they were in 2009. Now, this is an interesting graph. When I found out, I wanted to find out, okay, we've gone for property types. Let's look at what's happening at the moment to bedrooms and what seems to be selling. And again, this actually, Rotherham bucks the trend compared to most of Britain. What you'll tend to find in most of Britain is that the stuff that's actually selling is 2-bedroom properties, because first-time buyers can't afford 3 beds, and you landlords love your 2 beds because it offers a better return than your 1 beds. 1 beds have always been a bit of a pain in the backside, and again, 1-bedroom apartments, because you don't get many 1-bedroom houses, can stick. That's why it's really important that if you are going to buy yourself a 1-bedroom apartment, you get it for a good price, because if you are going to ever need to sell it, you're going to be on the market for quite a while. Then, as I said, 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, but it's the 4-bedroom that caught my eye. Now, again, let's look at the mean selling time, but the really interesting one is the median. And the reason the median, which is the middle figure, is that and I always take reference from the medium as opposed to the mean or the average, is that it doesn't take into account properties that have been sticking forever. And I think it's a better, but if you actually look, you've got some, 4-bedroom detached houses. They seem to be going like rocket ships. I have no idea why. Again, probably Chris and Dawn can have a chat about that later. But the fundamental thing is that 4-bed detached houses seems to be flying. Interesting. Now, in terms of types of properties that seem to be selling, again, looking at the medians, then the terraced and flats and semis and detached all seem to be around that 70-day mark, but coming back to flats, 119. So again, let's go back. Apartments are not growing in value particularly well, and seem to be taking a long while to sell. So if you've got an apartment, it might not be worth you selling it, but if you are going to buy one, then you should consider getting it at a damn good price. You can always go for the 2-bedroom terraced or the 2-bedroom semi, which offer probably the terraced will offer a better yield compared to the flat. Again, it's a balancing act which we'll come on to a little bit later. In terms of how long does it take to sell a property, this graph here goes through the different types, and I'd like you to particularly look at the purple line here and look at the trend. Now, what you'll notice in terms of how long it takes is that if you look around the 2011 mark, it was taking on average 200 days, and then slowly she has been going down to around that 100-day mark now. But I don't know if you can notice is that, and you've got to look at it quite with an analytical mind, but it's not in a straight line. You'll notice that it tends to go up and down, that up and down is a 1-year cycle. So what you'll find is that stuff takes longer to sell in the winter than it does the summer. And the peak of each wave is the winter, then she goes down for the summer. Can you see that in the purple line? Now this is important for you as a landlord. If you're ever going to buy a property, probably the winter might be the better time to buy when there is greater supply and there's less buyers out there. Remember, probably the most important question you should ask as a landlord, but for God's sake, don't go in on the first one and ask this question straight away, is, so tell me why you're moving. Because when it comes to getting a great deal, there's 2 types of buyers, the got to sells and the like to sells. And at the end of the day, you want to do the got to sells. The got to sells are death, divorce, relocation, need the cash, debt. The like to sells, I've got a 3-bed, I could quite fancy a 4-bed. Obviously, if mum's got tummy out here and they want to move to a different part of the area of the school, again, finding out, well, we'd like to move to another part of the town so we can get the kids in the school, that's when you put the offer in. You actually say, I'll put an offer in of X, but I'll ensure that you get to the house you want with us so you can get into the school that you want to go to. Remember, got to sell, like to sell, find the got to sells and work on it. This is the number of properties that have sold since 1995. And as you can see, in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was steadily growing and growing. And then it dropped off the cliff in 08, 09 when we had the financial crash. I love that little spike with the little point on that says stamp duty. That's all you landlords panicking like headless chickens, trying to get your money in before your 3%. Again, since then, there was a drop-off in the 2 months after that, but she's come back a treat. Okay, property is a case of demand and supply when it comes to prices. All economics is demand and supply. Now, when it comes to the growth of the property market, the supply is pretty much fixed in the fact is that only so many houses get built every single year. But the number of properties that are for sale is an important consideration. Now, what you'll notice is that at this end here, we started in 08 and she rocketed up to 2011, and then she's been slowly dropping down ever since. Again, can you see that roller coaster? Again, there are more houses on the market in the summer than the winter. So again, that's an important consideration when you are looking to buy a property is it takes longer to sell a property in the winter, but there's less of them to buy. So again, your job is harder. So that is why you do need an agent to find properties, and I do know that Bricknells do actually do an investment finding service. And Chris has informed me that on his blog, Rotherham Property Blog, he's going to be starting to put what he considers are the very best buy-to-let deals in Rotherham, irrespective of which agent is selling it. He's going to be uploading them. Where are you, Chris? You promised me that, haven't you?
I have promised you, Chris.
Good stuff. And now you've promised it in front of everyone else. Good. You see, it's really important as a landlord that you get the best sort of advice. And up until if you bought a property in 95 and 2000, you could make a money on property as easy as falling off a log. It didn't matter what property you bought, you made money. Now, with regard to what's happening in the property market, you would never dream of investing in a pension without advice. You do need to take advice and opinion. So use and abuse him, because he needs using and abusing. That's what Dawn tells me. He needs to be filled his days up. So, right. Talking of house moves, I thought this was a particularly interesting thing. Is that down the left-hand side is the average time, the average length of time that people move. And if you look throughout the 1995, the 1990s and early 2000s, it was dropping from around people moving every 23 years, and it got to its best point when it was around every 14 years in the early 2000s. Interestingly, if you go back to the 1980s, that figure was nearer 8 or 9, moving every 8 or 9 years. Now, when we then had the crash, less people moved, so she went up, and then she's slowly been moving down ever since. But interestingly, we're still at around 20 years. So why are we at 20 years, people moving every 20 years, as opposed to the every 8 or 9 years that people were moving back in the early in the 80s? And we're going to touch on that a little bit later, because again, it's important. Why the hell aren't people first-time buyers buying properties, and why the hell are they giving you the money? And why the hell why will they continue to give you money? And I'm going to prove to you that the rental market can only go one way. Okay. You are in this for yield as well. So I've done some averages and looked at what people are paying on average for a detached and a semi, a terraced and a flat. And then I've worked out what the average rent has been achieved and given a yield, the average yield being in the middle, and then the lower end and the upper end. I must stress to you, this isn't everything. So there are properties, especially HMOs and students, that will be off the scale at that end, and the really rough council areas, where you have to put your hard hat on. And there's going to be stuff at this end. But fundamentally, this is probably 80 or 90% of the market in terms of the yield range. What is, again, compared to the rest of the UK, terraced houses offer the best yields, whilst semis don't offer so greater yields, but you get a better class of tenant with less void periods. And again, semi-detached houses tend nationally to go up in value more. But again, trust you in Rotherham to prove everyone wrong. Your detached houses have actually performed the best, which is, again, I can't understand why, but you have. So let's move on to the second part of the presentation, talking about what's happening to home ownership and why people aren't buying houses anymore, because this is a really important consideration for you landlords. If all your tenants tomorrow decide that they're going to go and be first-time buyers, you're going to be up the creek without a paddle, and then the market will drop out, you'll get no returns, and it will be the end of the world. So let's look at the numbers, let's look at the history and take it from there. In 2001, 66,500 houses were homeownered, representing 65% of the market. Where do you think it was in 2011? Who wants to hazard a guess, numbers-wise? Up or down? Okay, who's going to go for up? Put your hands up. Who's going to go for down? Come on, let's see them hands. Okay. Actually went up. The reason we're looking at 2011 is that these are the census figures, okay? These were released 2.5 years ago, okay? The market is like a super tanker. So have numbers moved on since then? Yes, but not seismically, okay? But this is the scary bit. Look how there's been an additional 4,000 property owners, that's households, but the percentage has remained the same. So how can we get an uplift in home ownership but the percentages remain the same. This is why. You see, between 2001 and 2011, just over 600 houses a year were built in Rotherham. However, the number of rental properties went from 7,100, increased to 7,100, going from 5,100 to 12,200. All you landlords made an additional 7,139 rental properties, taking the percentage of private rental properties from 5% to 11.3%. And I think you're testament to that, because if you go back to 2001, if you were a letting agent and you had landlords, most landlords were what we call professional landlords with portfolios of 30, 40, 50, 60. I would hazard a guess that some of you here are more smaller landlords with property empires of 2 or 3 or 4. That was unheard of in 2001. This is a fundamental change in the type of landlord. And again, we're going to come on to this, why that was the case, and again, why the demand is going to remain. So, again, a little bit of a straw poll. What's happened to rents since 2008? So what I'm going to do is this. We're going to start at the top, and I want you to put your hands up where you think it's the right answer. So, who thinks rents have risen on average by 35.5%? 24.4? 18.4? No? 17.3? 10.4? 5.4? 10.4%. So why what makes Rotherham so good in terms of, and again, I've done some homework, and again, unemployment has actually dropped from 11.6 to 4.9%. Jobs are being created. Interestingly, the average wage has gone from around £360 in 2002 to £494 a week. That is the average wage of a Rotherham person. Interesting. Does that surprise anyone? Yeah, interesting. Great schools, great local authority, and again, you're having some great infrastructure works, and again, hopefully, the tram will get finished off. Again, there's some fears, will it suck people into Sheffield, or will it bring people out of Sheffield to Rotherham? Again, you could go to different towns in the UK, and both has happened. I think it's important that the local authority do its bit to encourage people for money to be sucked this way than the other way around. First time I've been to Rotherham train station today. That's an interesting place, isn't it? Right.
Depends what time of day.
Indeed, yeah. So, the future of home ownership and rental in Rotherham. So, why aren't the 18-year-olds, I know you're not, but you soon will be. So, I'm 46, I know I don't look it, but when I left university in 1993, I basically saved like hell for my first deposit. I had a bottom drawer where I'd get, your mum would buy your blankets and your linen, and you went without, and you saved like hell for the first deposit. So why aren't 18 to 25-year-olds in Great Britain, and that goes obviously for Rotherham as well, why aren't they buying properties anymore? So again, let's bring it back for a straw poll. Why aren't the 18 to 25s buying anymore? And you've got 3 options. So I want you to put your hand up. Your first option, if you think it's because property's too expensive, or job mobility, or can't get the deposit. Okay, right. Right. No one's saying, don't put your hands up on this one because you know the answer. Okay, when we had the financial crash in 2008, before then you could have a Northern Rock mortgage, and I'm not joking you. If you wanted a Northern Rock mortgage, you got a note from your mum. Please give Johnny a 125% mortgage. It was that easy, wasn't it? But then they genuinely were the lender of last resort. Basically, they would accept anyone. Okay, so at this time, I worked as the bank manager for the Halifax, and we were offering 95% mortgages. We were offering 100% mortgages. Everyone was offering 100% mortgages. But then the financial crash came. Basically, the legs got kicked from underneath us. And basically, 100% mortgages went, 125% mortgages went, 95% mortgages went. And you were lucky if you had to put probably 20% down. So the question is this. When did 95% mortgages come back? So Again, let's do a straw poll. Who thought it was 2016? We've got one there. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11. I count backwards, it's great, isn't it? 10, it's not going to be anything else, is it? They came back 3 months later in 2009. You're going to say, well, to get a mortgage, you need to have a clean credit history. Yes, of course you should have a clean credit history. If you've been reneging on your loan payments, you shouldn't get a mortgage. Sorry. But if you're putting your neck on the line, then the builder society, because when you repossess a house, again, you'd be amazed how much the banks do lose from it. You've got to make sure that they're going to get it back. 2009 is when 95% mortgages came back. Right. There's some of you in this room who can remember mortgage rates of 15%. Who can remember those? Yeah. Now, I went on to Money Supermarket, that well-known website, yesterday, and actually looked at what a first-time buyer mortgage I could get for a 95% mortgage. Now, this is on the assumption you don't have to have any mum or dad backing you up on this. This is just you finding the deposit. Okay. Yes, you can't have any counter court judgments against you. Yes, you have to be a sensible person and pay your bills on time. But I think that most people fit into that category. Now, a 3% fixed at 2.49 with no application fee. That's cheap. Now, if you go and look at the Daily Mail, it says, well, if you're a first-time buyer and you need the sexy rates of 1.49%, they forget to put that bit in, don't they? Because bad news sells newspapers. Of course, 1.49 is a lot sexier than 2.49, but there's nothing wrong with 2.49, is there? And then a 3-year discount at 2.89 and a 5-year fixed at 3.94. That's a bargain compared to 15%. So, I went house hunting yesterday and I found this very nice 2-bedroom bay-fronted terraced house on the market with a certain estate agency who shall remain nameless for the princely sum of 80 of your 1,000 English pounds. Very nice, 80 grand. What's that going to cost me? £329 a month in an interest and repayment mortgage on a 25-year loan. Barclays don't do 35-year loans, so I had to go to the Ipswich. And they, at 2.89 variable, would cost me £279 a month. And to rent, the cheapest I found was £425 a month. There was stuff at £450. Hold on. You can buy it for £329 a month, and you can rent it for £450. Okay, so you've got to find a deposit of £3,900. If I went without that, and Sky Sports, £100 a month, and I went without going out on a Saturday night and a Friday night, and I went without going to Ibiza with my glow sticks, I could save that £3,900 within probably 18 months. But the world has changed, and people don't like saving. And the thing is this, when I saved my deposit up for my house with my wife, I had to save a deposit of £3,000, and that was 20 years ago. And £3,000 20 years ago is worth a lot more than £3,900 today. If you actually look at the newsletters, the newsletters, the Rotherham property newsletters, I ghostwrite those. It's not a secret. I ghostwrite them for Chris and Dawn. And I've actually written an article recently which actually proves that in real terms, property is cheaper when you look at property prices and salaries today than it was in 2007. When it comes to what you earn as a salary and what the property is worth. And you need to, I say only, £3,900 is a lot of money. But it isn't if you put your mind to it and go without. But we all went without, but these youngsters don't want to go without. And I'll show you why they don't want to go without, and why they will continue to do what they do, and why you as landlords will continue to what's the best word to describe it? To make money from it. I'm sorry, we're in a capitalist society. You're here to make money. I'm sorry. Because if you didn't house them, who else would house them? Councils haven't got any money to build any houses, have they? So, why the hell are people renting today as opposed to buying when it's cheaper to buy and you only have to go and find £3,900? And I know it's a lot of money, but if you put your mind to it, you'd find it. If you went without the latest iPhone, Sky TV, and you didn't go out. Because when we were saving up, you didn't go out, did you? So, let's have a look at this graph. In 1918, the dark bit is the private rented sector. The bit in the middle is social housing, or as we like to call it, council housing. I like to call it you like to call it social housing. And then the bit at the bottom is the graphy bit is owner occupation. So as you start in 1918, 75% of houses were privately rented and 25% of them were owner occupied. So to start off with, first comment is this: Britain has not been a nation of homeowners. Go back 100 years and only 25% of people owned their own home. As we go through the 20s and 30s, home ownership rose very incrementally to the early 50s, where we're at 30%. What was happening is that whilst home ownership was remaining pretty stable, what was happening was people who used to rent from a private landlord would start to rent from a council. And council houses, they were newer, and again, because it's a social element, you got it cheaper. Again, you're going to move into a cheaper house. It's human nature. And then what happened was, after the war, in the 50s and in the 60s and the 70s, that's when owner occupation really started to rise. But what you'll notice is that the council house building was really rocketing in the 50s and 60s. Homes for heroes, that sort of thing. So what was happening in the 50s and 60s and 70s was home ownership was rising, so were council house building was going, so the only thing that was being squeezed out was private rented. And as we go throughout, and as you look, what happens is that the social housing was growing all the way up to 1979, until a certain daughter from Grantham, my hometown. What did Margaret Thatcher do in 1979? Right to buy. Can you then notice that then from then on it starts to pinch off? The percentage, the proportion of council housing. So an important consideration here is this. Everybody thinks the growth of the private rental sector started in 2007 and 2008 with the financial crash. If you can actually see, it started to grow in the early 90s. And what's been happening is that this graph goes to 2008, but if you continue on, we are now presently nationally at around 17% privately rented. We are at around 18% council houses, and the rest made up of owner-occupiers. Does that surprise anyone? So, let me show you why that has taken place and why rental will only continue to grow. So, back in the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher decided that you could buy a council house. Up until that point, what happened with council housing was this. They built two types of houses. 2 3-bedroom semis for families and little bungalows. So you'd move into the house, bring your family up, the family would leave, you'd leave the semi-detached house, go and move into the bungalow, and then once you died, they carry out in a box, and then the whole thing repeats through. So a new family moves into your semi, moves in, kids move out, go into the bungalow, you die, and it just recycles round. Okay, so basically the house kept on being recycled until you allowed someone to buy their own house, and it took one out of the equation. You know, I talked around people moving every 8 or 9 years back in the 1980s. Those are actually false figures, because if you all the numbers, all the council house people bought them and then sold them on 3 years later to make some of this. That skewed the figures. We've always only ever moved probably only every 15 years as a nation. It's just that there was a dumping of properties on the market with people buying them off the council at a cheap price and then making loads of money a few years later. So we are only still moving on average the same amount that we were. It's just that it's, you know what they say, lies, damn lies and statistics. So let's carry on. You see, just before we go back there, if you cannot rent one from the local authority, who else and you can't buy, who are you going to call? You lot. The next stage 2 of why rental has continued to grow. Was anybody a landlord before 1988-89? If you were a landlord and you owned properties before 1988 and the Housing Act, which kicked in a year later, what happened is that you had such things as what's called regulated tenancies or controlled tenancies, and depending on what type of tenancy you had, a tenant could actually live in there for life and then pass it on to their kids, and their kids could pass it, this is the worst case scenario, pass it on to their kids at you know, like 1p a year. Okay, I'm taking the mickey, but really low rents. Now, I don't think 1p a year is going to offer you great rates of returns or yields. And also, if you wanted to get people out, you almost had to go to the House of Lords, the High Court, not the High, but I'm taking the mickey here. The hoops you had to jump to get someone out if they weren't a good tenant and they weren't paying the rent were absolutely appalling. And that is why an awful lot of landlords, professional landlords, you know, you had to be a professional. And how can we say if you wanted to get rid of a tenant, you had to, how can I say, send the boys round, which is not particularly good, especially if you are a small landlord, because you don't want to get involved with that nastiness. But the Housing Act 1988 brought in this absolutely wonderful assured short-hold tenancy, which gives a lot more protection to the tenants, but it also gave an awful lot of more protection to your landlords. And that's why it was easier to get people out if they weren't playing the game. The third reason why the rental market has continued to grow is this. Back in the up until 1997, if you wanted to borrow money from a bank and you wanted to get a buy-to-let mortgage, there was no such thing as a buy-to-let mortgage. You had to go and join the bank with the guy from Sheffield Steel borrowing money at commercial rates. Now, back in the 1990s, Bank of England base rate was around 5 or 6%, which means commercial rates were around 7 or 8%. If you can remember, property prices in the 1990s were pretty flatline. So if you're not getting any capital growth and you're paying 8%, you need to get a yield of 10% to make it worth your while. Yeah? Well, the only properties that offer great yields are L-holes, wood chip on the wall, electric panel heaters, no double glazing, rising damp Rigsby style properties. But then in 1997 we had buy-to-let mortgages, and all of a sudden what happened was we had a new introduction of a type of landlord called a dinner party buy-to-let landlord. Now, some of you here might be a dinner party buy-to-let landlord. Who here would like to know the definition of a dinner party buy-to-let landlord? So there you are eating in your beef Wellington and going, oh yes, we've just been down to the Barrett's new home site and we've bought the show home, but it's so wonderful and all the furniture's way too small, but we wanted to buy it and all the doors have been taken. Have you noticed show homes, they have the doors on? Little tip for you there. So they buy the show home, they fall in love with it, and let's be honest, if you're a professional landlord, the last thing you want to be doing is buying a show home because you pay way too much over the odds for it. But that didn't matter, because in 2000, 2001, 2, 3 and 4, we were getting 20% growth. It didn't matter that you were getting a rubbish yield because it was going up in value. And, oh yes, we're buying one, and people are like sheep. So if everyone's buying one, we'll buy one. That's how a lot of people got into buy-to-let. It's not a criticism, it's a fact. You see, if you're a tenant, where would you rather live? There or here? I'd love to live here. Up until the 1990s, it was what's-name holes, properties that you could only rent. Now, for the matter of, say, £100 difference, £150 difference, you could upgrade from a terraced house to a gorgeous thing like this. Amazing. Hold that thought, because we'll come back to it. Right. Then, in 08 and 09, we had the property crash. Now, there's something really weird about British homeowners. If you bought your property for £100,000 in, say, 1995, and In 2008, it had got to £300,000. How much profit have you made? You bought it for 100,000 and it's now worth £300,000. How much profit would you make if you sold? £200,000. Then the property market crashed and it took your £300,000 house to 250. How much money have you made? No, you haven't. You've lost 50 grand. Because yes, but people don't think that way. That's what happened in 08 and 09. People perceived, even though they bought it for 100 grand and it was worth 300 and it went down to 250, everyone was saying, I've lost 50 grand. No, you haven't, but that's how people think. We're all funny buggers. And that's what so what was happening was this. All the people that needed to move, you know, Jim from Droitwich that got his new job in Sheffield, or Rotherham or Barnsley, with his gorgeous David Wilson 4-bedroom detached house, double garage, ensuite and conservatory, was saying, I'm not losing 50 grand. I'm going to put it up for rent. And what we had was all you dinner party let landlords bought gorgeous 2 and 3 bedroom semis, and then Dave from Droitwich, and obviously there must be someone in Rotherham that had to go back to Droitwich or somewhere down south, were putting your gorgeous 3 and 4 bedroom detached houses on the market because I'm not losing 50 grand. Now we've had 2 injections of really gorgeous properties onto the market. And there's something really weird happens when it comes to rentals. If you've got a property worth £100,000 and the rent is £500 a month, does a £200,000 house get £1,000 a month rent? Probably nearer 700. So what this means is this. If you wanted to upgrade from a terraced house to a 2-bed semi, you might only pay an extra £100 or £150 in rent, but the mortgage would probably be double. There's no way, if you're living in one of those, if you've got no social pressure, are you going to downgrade? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but no first-time buyer has ever been able to buy their first house as a modern 3-bedroom semi, have they? Can you? At no time, generally, is your first house being a gorgeous David Wilson 3-bedroom semi with garage and a conservatory. No, you go in at the bottom. You buy the 2-bedroom terraced house. Do it up. You buy the 3-bedroom terraced house. You do it up. And you go buying the semi. You work the ladder. But what's been happening is these first time supposed buyers or renters have been upgrading from terraced houses to gorgeous houses, and now, if they did want to move, they would have to downgrade. Now, if there was social pressure, which we'll come on to in a second, that would be great, but there is no social pressure, and I'll explain why. Because the Daily Mail, I blame the Daily Mail for our troubles, and you must thank the Daily Mail for why you are sitting here now. Because it's the Daily Mail, bad news sells newspapers, who actually say, first-time buyers, whoa, 30% deposit required. Oh, they seem to forget the fact that, to get the best rates, 1.49%. Remember, 2.49%, fixed for 5 years at 3.89. That is cheap money. It is so, if you work your sums out, it is cheaper to buy than it is to rent at the lower end of the market. But there's no social pressure. When we bought our houses, everyone else was buying their own house. So because people are like sheep, well, if they're doing it, I'll do it. And we all bought it. Now there's no pressure. And now kids, they're spending money on this, on holidays and £100 Sky packages. And there is no social pressure from either their peers or their parents to buy. And I can't see that changing. Because I think, and I don't say this in a bad way, but I think society has changed. Not in a bad way. Some people say it has. Bad, I don't think it has. I just think attitude to renting has changed. Let's look back at the graph. We are presently nationally around 17 or 18% privately rented. And everybody says probably in 10 years' time we'll be at 25 or 30%. And everyone goes, no, it'll be the end of the world, riots on the streets. Look, we were at 30% privately rented back in the early 60s. We're only going back to where we were. Therefore, unless there is a seismic change in the way these millennials think and act, we will not change. We have grown ourselves, we are in a society that wants instant everything. You know, when we had to go dating, we had to fumble around and do, hi, you right, and blind dates. Now it's swipe right for love. You know, you'd say 10 years ago, someone say, I'm dating on the internet, you're going, weirdo. Now everyone dates on this. Amazon, instant buying. TV on our own time. Who does? We all do TV on our own time. That's just the way of the world. Is it a bad thing? I don't think it is. Just society changes. But I think the rental market will continue to grow because there is absolutely no social pressure from you guys, because you've all been reading the Daily Mail, and there's no social pressure from your parents. And why the hell would you want to, when if you did want to buy, you'd have to downgrade from that to that? I just think the British have never fallen in love with buying their own home. I just think it was a fad. Fad's the wrong word. Just a phase of British society in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And until attitudes change, it will continue to grow and only grow. But I have noticed one thing about tenants moving forward. They are getting pickier. Okay? They will pay top dollar, but you lot landlords can't be shabby with your decorating and your carpets and that, oh, it'll do. Okay? You're getting a better class of tenant who's expecting more in life. Okay? They're going more from Tesco's to Sainsbury's in terms of their attitude, and if we're not careful, we'll all end up with Waitrose tiled tenants. But again, if they're Waitrose tenants, they'll pay Waitrose prices, all being well. So, I'm on my last furlong before we move over to these awesome guys. 2 ways to earn money from buy-to-let: yield and capital growth. So, here is the yield and capital growth map of loveliness. Okay? And basically, the dark blue areas are where the gorgeous yields are, but the capital growth, it's a balancing act. Because I don't know if you've noticed, yield and capital growth are on a seesaw. Okay? There are very exceptional properties that, I mean, who wants a high yielding, high capital growth property? Yeah, I'll have some of that. Okay, but the rule of thumb is this: if you want a high yield, which tends to be the poorer areas that offer greater yields, the capital growth tends to be lower, because not poorer stuff doesn't go up in value so much, as opposed to the nicer areas which offer better capital growth. You know, your likes of your Wickersleys in the redder areas, but again, your yields are going to be pretty poor. Or you can go somewhere in the middle, which is probably more the yellow areas, which offers somewhere in the middle. And what you need to do, and we're going to bring this in, is some people say, should I chase yield? Should I chase capital growth? Well, the biggest question you must ask when it comes to buy-to-let is this: why are you buying, and when are you going to get out? Because some people need capital growth, some people need yield, income, and it depends on your personal circumstances. Everyone is different. And again, I think that question might just come up in the panel, boys and girls. So, really, don't chase yield for yield's sake, because capital growth is important, especially with inflation. I know we've had low inflation recently, but you know, it could go depending on what happens with Brexit. Everyone is different, and really, at the end of the day, you've got to take advice. So, that's the end of my presentation. I think we're bang on 40 minutes, which is good.